Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, Aliza, thanks a million for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Luke. I'm excited.
Well, I'm grateful for you, Aliza, because I know our paths have crossed at various points at churches, at art shows, most recently at a youth conference. And you're always that person that people are like, wow, I learned so much from or was so inspired by. And so that kind of led to me sending you a note a couple weeks back to say, hey, want to jump on the podcast? So it's sweet to have you here. And there's a lot we're going to dive into. And I know that it's always good to start off with a rich, deep, profound, heart-to-heart theological question. And so with that in mind, along with your passion for ministry and artistic creativity, you're a huge Marvel fan. I know it's the deepest spiritual question I could lead off with. So I want to know, who is your favorite Marvel character? What's your favorite Marvel movie? Why?
I got into Marvel because I was a youth pastor for a short amount of time during COVID. And the only thing I could think about was, how do I connect with these 12-year-old boys? And they all liked Marvel. And I was like, okay, let's watch it chronologically together. So that's kind of what launched me into Marvel. So I haven't seen it in a couple of years. So admittedly, when I call myself a big fan, there's going to be other fans who are like, yeah, that girl does not know what she's talking about.
I'm sure you're ahead of me.
Well, I watched them chronologically. It took a long time.
The whole, is it 20 some? Like 20, isn't there 23 videos?
Oh, I deep dove. I was
wow.
out. I was trying to, I got really into it. And I have to say my favorite is Spider-Man. I love him so much, but I haven't seen the most recent one. So maybe I'm not that big of a fan, but it was when I was in COVID, I was stuck in my apartment and I was like, I'm just going to watch every single Marvel movie.
Yeah. So is Spider-Man your favorite character?
Probably. There's something, I think that there's just something sweet about that story of kind of this underdog who people, don't really see. And then I don't know, I just appreciated that. And the reason I got into it was because of those 12-year-old boys. And so that was great.
You're trying to shape their lives spiritually and they don't know it, but they're shaping your life when it comes to
I know. And every week I would try to I'm like, hey, can I choose a different Marvel character and somehow spin this into a theological lesson to teach you about the love of God? And it's so much better than others.
You know what? It's very true. It's amazing when you have a passion, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Marvel or something else, how it's dangerous sometimes, especially when you're preaching. It's like every illustration could be drawn from.
That's right.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, hey, I think there's something unique about a character where I like the fact that Spider-Man he's very unpolished.
Yeah.
And everybody else is pretty polished. And there's something easy, I think, about connecting with the human side of him.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Don't discount them when they're young, right? I appreciate it.
And hey, if you can swing between buildings,
I know.
that's always a win.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, hey, speaking of life-changing experiences and delving into things that impact us and, creative work by Stanley and others that has touched generation after generation, it would seem. I know that you're really gifted as a creative and that there's a lot of creatives listening in. And I feel like the first time I met you was right around the time you were publishing the first book you published or self-published, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. And would love to kind of zoom in on that for a second, because I know there's people out there who are thinking, I'd love to dive into painting or sculpting or writing, poetry or maybe a novel or something like that. And it can be both a journey of self-discovery and kind of discovering what a creative feels like they can give to others or how their skill and passion contributes well to the lives of others. So I'd love to know, when did you first start writing? And especially in writing a book, which, congrats, by the way, that's no small feat. What were some of the best lessons you learned along the way in self-publishing?
I can't trace the time I started writing, Luke. It was just one of those things that I think I think Flannery O'Connor or someone talks about how in order to live, she writes. And that's sort of how I
Mm,
always felt. Like, don't quote me on that, but that was the idea, is that in order for me to process anything in my entire life, I had to write it down.
mm,
And so I started writing my novel in 2014, long time ago now.
yeah.
When my mom she was diagnosed with cancer. And so I needed some way to kind of
Wow.
work through what was happening there. And so I was like, I'll write a novel. And it wasn't about cancer. It was just some cathartic way for me to get the emotions that I was feeling inside
Mm,
out. And then it took me a really long time to get to the point of self-publishing, because Luke, I thought, well, I just had this dream as this like kind of young teenage girl that I would be the next like New York Times best-selling author. And so I just really dreamed quite big. I remember
yeah.
like going to Indigo and going to different bookstores and going to every single popular book that was in the genre that I had written in, and finding like who were their literary agents, who were their
Hmm.
publishers. Like I would find it, and then I'd go home and I would send these queries to try and get published. And so I
Yeah.
sent it to 75 different people in New York City, and I was rejected 75 times.
Wow.
And every time I got rejected in the beginning,
Yeah.
I used it as fuel to like, okay, I got rejected. I'm going to send it in.
Mm,
I'm going to send it out again. I'm going to send it out again. Um, and it was just this really interesting thing, Luke, because I had always told myself, like, I'm never going to self-publish, because the people who self-publish are the people who don't get published. So like, I was not going to do that. And then I had this experience with God where he really kind of worked through some things in my heart and showed me, Aliza, the only reason why you want to be published by a New York Times, a New York, one of the top 5 publishing houses, was because I wanted to be known. And
mm,
so I was searching for a way to be known through
mm.
publishing. And for me, self-publishing was actually a sacrifice to Jesus, saying like, I'm going to do this thing where I will not be known. I think I sold 200 books. Like, it was not about being known. It was not about making money. It was about this offering to God. Like, I
Mm.
feel like this is a way that you have wired me to write, and I'm going to self-publish knowing that I'm not going to be known. I'm not going to get popular. And I'm not going to get money, but I'm going to trust that you are the person who knows me. And so it actually became this very deep spiritual thing for me.
Hmm. Hmm. Almost, it sounds like, correct me if I'm wrong, but like the beauty of like creating for the sake of creating, and
Yeah.
knowing that God delights in that, whether it's 200 copies or 2 million copies.
Absolutely. Yeah. And,
Yeah.
and something that really stood out to me was in Zechariah, do not despise small beginnings. And I feel
Hmm.
like there's so many times in my life, I can get caught up in this lie or this cycle of lies. Like, if I don't do something great, then it wasn't
Hmm.
worth doing. And I
Hmm.
think that a lot of the time as creative people, we actually just have to do it for the sake of creating, just like what you
Yeah.
said, like God has wired us in certain ways. And a lot of people, it's like, if I'm not creating, I'm not living. And so it's like, who cares how many people that goes out to? Like, it can be
Mm.
this small beginning, it can be this offering to God.
That is so well said. And I mean, I'm encouraged by the fact, and maybe you could speak to this, but a lot of people would have quit after rejection number 5,
Yeah.
27, 48, because it's not easy to, I'm sure, to pour your heart into something creative, and to know that there's like dozens of people that are like, no, we're good.
Yeah.
And yet I know that obviously you've continued creating since then. I know that you've written a children's book since then. And so could I just ask on that front, in the face of rejection, which many creatives experience, and some people who aren't creating necessarily, but experience rejection in other spheres, maybe, applying for a dream job and they say no. Like, what were some of the things you learned from that experience that caused you to keep going, to keep creating, and to keep dreaming?
I think that partly I'm just a little foolish, and it takes me a little long to learn. It just takes me a while to catch up with everybody else. It's like, Eliza, maybe you should have just stopped trying after 40 times. But I think, Luke, that when you begin to understand the way that God has wired you,
Mhm.
you can stop um, doing those things. You can stop creating for a while. And then it gets to the point where it's like, I have to do this. And
Mhm.
so I think that for a lot of people, like when you experience rejection, maybe we take some time to lick our wounds, but it's like, I guess it comes back to the why. And I always had to come back to my why, like even for my children's book. So I published that over COVID, and I and totally different experience, totally different reason why. I was not publishing that to do something big. I was publishing it for my niece and my nephew. That was
Mm,
my why. And so
yeah.
I think that, and it was simple and it was sweet and it was little and it was heartfelt. But I think that that's something that we need to remember when we experience rejection, or when we were like going to put ourselves back out there. It's like, what's my why? Because
Mhm.
if we don't craft that why, I think that rejection always stings. It always hurts. Like I've never been able to get away from it not hurting. But
Yeah.
I think we're reminded, like, okay, but this was the reason why I was going to do it in the first place.
Yeah. That's a great word. That's a great word. Well, I know, Eliza, that we were talking about this right before we clicked record, but often, especially Reformed faith traditions, are known for statements of faith and doctrinal perspectives. Like, this is what we believe, this is the
Mm.
truth, et cetera, which are great things in their own right. And I mean, this is more maybe my opinion in some ways, and you're welcome to agree or disagree. But the reality of embracing art or creativity, poetry, painting, etc., dance as an avenue for encountering God seems to be something that is totally overlooked.
Mm.
And so, how would you say that art has become an avenue in your life, or creative writing,
Mm.
through which you experience God, and also through which you respond to God, which how you express your love for Him?
Luke, I think that, and I probably am going to come off sounding a little mystical, and some of our friends might be listening in
Let's
with
go there. Let's go
a
there.
little woo woo. I like to joke around that I'm like partially charismatic, partially mystical. Like I just like, take my favorite parts of traditions and just mash them together.
It's like a
Um,
stained glass window.
I love it. I love it. I really believe deeply that everything that God has created is art. And so
Mhm.
I think that we can miss out on experiencing who God is, when we keep it just to knowledge, and there is place for that. My goodness, we need good
Mhm.
doctrine, we need knowledge, we need all of that stuff. But when
Mhm.
I walk outside, I remember like when I was like 15 or 16 years old and I was working at a camp, and I remember always seeing this certain butterfly fly by me, and it would, I don't know, like I'm not into science. Was this like a native butterfly? I don't know what, like, who knows? My immediate reaction, and I think because God has just, I'm so thankful, just has given me quite a vibrant imagination. I just felt like I was like, this is like God to me. Like God made this butterfly, and it was like a reminder to me that he was with me and he was present with me.
Mhm.
I went to Iceland a couple of years ago, and it was the most beautiful, it's the most spectacular place I'd ever seen. Oh my gosh. And every single thing I did there, every place I went, every step I took, every brook I saw like gurgling, I felt surrounded by God.
Yeah.
And I just think that there is something, like nature specifically, but even when you read someone's book and you feel like God spirit is in this person and they are writing words that are speaking to me, or there's a painting or a portrait and it's like there's something that's happening in me when I'm experiencing this artwork. I think that God communicates to us in so many ways, and when we limit him, we can just miss out on those experiences. And so I personally, and I know that's not for everybody, I'm so thankful for the experiences that I've had with Jesus because of other people's creativity, because of the creativity he's put inside of me, and more specifically, because of God's creativity. He is the most creative person. So when you walk outside tonight and see the sunset, or last night, I was driving home at like 10 p.m. and there were stars. And so I just stopped and I rolled my window down and I just stuck my head out and just looked at the stars for like
Yeah.
15 minutes because, Luke, I just felt like God created this. And I know that there's
Mhm.
a lot of scientific reasons why he did it, but for me, it just felt beautiful. And
Yeah.
I think that one of the most compelling things about Jesus is his beauty. And when we are talking to people about Jesus, and when we want people to understand who Jesus is, when we don't talk about his beauty, like there's something so compelling about him. And
Yeah.
so I just personally believe that God has an invitation for us through his artwork, to
Mm.
experience him.
Yeah. The invitation to be creating and recreating in
Yes.
light of who Jesus is and what he's done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Well, I wonder, Eliza, I mean, you've said some great words already with regards to starting with understanding your why. But for those people who are listening and who are like, amen, sister, like, yes, like creation as a canvas that God is
Mm.
masterfully demonstrating his creative brilliance on every single day. And like God is a creative, and we feel called to create. And you were saying, let's imagine, for example, one of them like called you up or said, hey, can we grab coffee together? And they're saying, you know what, I love to create. I want to create. I want to weave or sculpt or you name it, but I don't know where to start. And I don't know how to interweave this with my faith, with what I believe. I don't know how, I've been raised in a setting where it's all about what practical thing you can do for the church or for others. So I know how to like mow grass and make meals and shovel driveways, et cetera, et cetera. But how do I begin to understand the way creative work brings vibrancy to life? What would you say to them?
Well, let me first say, I just planted a church. And so I now know firsthand the importance of someone who will mow the lawn. So I really
Hey,
appreciate the practicalities there.
thank you, lawnmowers. Yeah.
Exactly, because I have been very much a creative for my whole life. And so I
Mm,
can miss out sometimes on how important the practical work is. So thank you to all of you. But I do think that there is so much space to bring. I just don't know if we ever need to divorce creativity from faith, Luke. Like
mm,
God is the person who created it. Why do we always try to be like, this is the thing I can do that will be useful to God?
mhm,
When, in my experience, when I focus on how I can be most useful to God or most useful to church or most useful to bringing God's kingdom to earth, it is when I have become most in the way of what God himself is doing. Like
mm,
I get so caught up in like, how can I do the right thing? How can I be useful? And so many times God's like, Aliza, like, I want you to just be who I have created you to be. I
mm,
am doing a lot of work. And girl, you are really in the way right now. And so I would just encourage people, like, it's going to be different for all of us, but the way that you feel like God has wired you, lean into that. And there is
mm,
space. And I understand, and I say this with tenderness and compassion, that in some of our churches there may not feel like there is space.
mm,
So could we be people who create space for that? At people who are listening, could we become the ones who invite people in? Could we find creative ways to bring people in? Because the church is a body. Every single person is of vital importance. We all have something to offer.
yeah.
And so maybe this would encourage us to try to create spaces for more creativity.
Yeah. And what would you say to the person who's like discovering that creativity still? They're like, I love to create.
Mm.
I've never had a drawing lesson or a writing class or anything in my life. What would you speak to them in terms of saying, hey, this is how you can begin to discover what you were made to do?
Yeah, well, I think you try it. I think that um there's, what is it, like perfection is the enemy of progress, or like whatever that
Mm,
is. Like we need to remove the idea that we need to do this perfectly. And I think, Luke, don't you feel like this is with everything? Like the process is what's the most fun, right? Like we have, whenever I do something, I write an article or write a book or whatever, I finish it. And then I'm almost disappointed that it's done, because it was the process that was the most enjoyable. It was the
mm,
process that was the most life-giving for me. It's the same thing for my faith in Jesus. Like I'm so thankful we never arrive with him, because it's the
mm.
process in which we realize who we are becoming. And so
Yeah.
I would just say to dive in, like however you want to do it. You don't have to be good at it. Who cares? Who cares if you're not good at it? Just dive in and like enjoy the process.
Yeah, that's a good point because it's good to remember that everything we do now that we think we're good at,
Yeah,
whether it's like playing a sport or a certain vein of work, et cetera, we were awful at
totally.
one point in time, right?
Totally.
And we tend to forget that about ourselves.
Oh
But
yeah. And
thank
you
you for
look
that.
back on things that you've done and you're like, that was terrible. I did that.
Hmm.
I'll think about that. Like I published my novel 9 years ago, and or so I wrote it 9 years ago, and it's like, oh, this is not good. Like I would write it so much differently. But I also think for creatives, and in your creativity, there's like room to just allow that to be true in the time that it was true, like
Mm,
when I put that out there in the world, it was true for me then. And
yeah.
thank the Lord, I have changed a lot. I have matured a lot. And then I'll write something, and in 2023, it was true for me then. So
Hmm.
um, I don't know. I think that could also be something to remember.
Well, and that it means that our art can be a reflection of
Mm.
where we were and who we were in certain seasons, and yeah, how we've grown and evolved and changed. So,
Yeah.
which in itself is kind of beautiful and creative.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
well, hey, to pivot with you, Aliza, a little bit, I know a quote I read that you wrote off your website is you write, I'm an apprentice of Jesus Christ and have devoted my entire life to following him and loving him. And I'm endlessly grateful for the life he's given me. And I really love the language you use there
Mm.
and would love for you to unpack specifically that phrase of being an apprentice of Jesus Christ. What does it mean to
Mm.
be an apprentice to Jesus?
Well, I totally and completely stole that from Dallas Willard and John
Oh,
Mark.
hey,
So I am by no means
this is
the originator
good.
of that language. I just read and then steal.
That's
Or
right. Sometime I can just say, as John Mark Comer, Dallas Willard, and Eliza Latta say.
Oh, if I could be in a sentence with those two, that would be
Hey, it's
amazing.
great company.
Yeah, no kidding. But I think that the thing about the idea of it being an apprentice that so compelled me was the
Mm,
fact that the work is very relational. It's very like, it's not a teacher and a student in a classroom, you know?
mhm.
I was never a great student. So that, that was not really my forte. I like the hands-on learning and
Yeah.
I like, getting in there and, like doing things. And so I so appreciated that word picture of being an apprentice to Jesus. It's like this shoulder to shoulder doing things together. And there is
Mhm.
very much a, relationship that somebody is the master. It's not
Yeah.
me. So we don't have like this equal, but we have this shoulder to shoulder, like learning, working together, co-laboring with Christ. I am such an advocate that we are co-laborers with Jesus. Thankfully, the burden is all on his shoulders, just like he said that his burden is light. He takes that, but we co-labor with him. We do the work with him. And so
Mm,
I just have found that the language of apprenticeship to Jesus means that I come under his rule and reign. He is the master. He's the Lord of my life. That there's longevity there. There's learning for life there. And there's relationship. And so I appreciate that.
yeah. Yeah. And it is so much richer and deeper than just a one-time
Yeah.
prayer or maybe a
Yeah.
get out of hell free mentality
Right.
towards faith
Right.
and relationship. Yeah.
Right. There's
Thank
that.
you.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You're welcome.
Well, in line with that reality of being an apprentice to Jesus, co-laboring with him, walking with him, following his example. I can't speak for you, but I know for myself that I feel like in our world today, it can be there's a lot of different need and a lot of different pursuits that we could throw ourselves into. And so, in the midst of a fast paced, rapidly evolving, even distraction filled world, what would you consider some of the best practices for spiritual formation in step with that journey of apprenticeship under Jesus?
I think the number one thing that I have come to practice is Sabbath, and it's hard.
Hmm.
It's so hard, Luke. I take 24 hours off of work, and that has been a real choice. I've begun to study Sabbath in Scripture. I've begun to read books on Sabbath, and I cannot tell you the life that it has restored in me
Hmm.
and the creativity. To go back to our original couple of points, like when I Sabbath, I often find myself by the end of my Sabbath, I want to write a poem or I
Hmm.
want to paint. Like God like has instilled, like the creativity has been like dragged out of me all week long, and then God in his kindness fills me back up. So I would say
Hmm.
Sabbath is so vital, vital, vital. It's vital for us to be have endurance as followers of Jesus in the world. It's vital to be countercultural when the world is constantly moving over.
Hmm.
It's nonstop. How do we live differently? Well, stopping for an entire day would be a really good place to start.
True
Um,
say.
and it's vital for my soul and my
Hmm.
relationship with Jesus. Like it can get so loud and cluttered that when I take 24 hours off, I finally, most weeks, because I'm so busy, most weeks by the time I Sabbath, I realize like, oh, my emotional health this week wasn't very good. Like I'm
Hmm.
actually holding a lot of resentment against this person, or I'm actually feeling a lot of fear and anxiety about this, or like I haven't been honest with Jesus about how I'm feeling. And when you Sabbath, guess what you get to do? You get to not run away from all your feelings because you have stopped and you have to face it, and it's hard.
True.
And then it's like, I don't want to face this, but you face it in the presence of Jesus, and you bring it to Jesus, and you realize, like, wow, God, like I don't want to live like just in this frantic pace. Like, I want to live slowly and lightly with you, to keep step with you.
Mhm.
So my biggest spiritual practice right now, among others, would be Sabbath.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you practice Sabbath, would you be willing to share some of the nuts and bolts of that? Like some of different things for different people, obviously, but in your own walk with God, what are the different practices during that day that are really life-giving for you?
Yeah. So I Sabbath on from Friday night to Saturday night at about 5 p.m. to 5 p.m.
Mhm.
I pastor a church. So Saturday night, you kind of have to start kind of getting ramped up for Sunday service. But I stay off social media. That's just something for me that's really helpful. It's not, I love social media. We make a great connections, but for me, it's just helpful to sign off. And so my lens in which I view Sabbath is what feels Sabbathy to me. I have coined
Hmm.
it as an adjective. What feels Sabbathy? And so I just worked my day through what feels Sabbathy to me. And Luke, what feels Sabbathy to me most Sabbaths is not doing my dishes,
Hmm.
is sleeping in and not
Mhm.
waking up to an alarm, is making like a good breakfast, is
Mhm.
going to, there's a conservation area near my house. So I'll often go on a hike, and I'll either bring a book or I'll bring my notebook, and I'll go and chat with Jesus about it. I love to read. So I have a specific Sabbath book, and I only read it on Sabbaths. I read one
Hmm.
chapter on, like, and I just have worked my way through that. I will go out to dinner with a friend, or a couple Sabbaths ago, I went laser tagging with my niece and nephew.
Nice.
And just things like, it doesn't, I think I thought that Sabbath meant that I was going to sit down for 8 hours, study scripture, pray the whole time,
Hmm.
and the thing about Sabbath is that it's like meant for us. Like Jesus says that, like, Sabbath is meant for man, right? Like he created it for us. God created rest so that we would experience like deep restoration with him. And
Yeah.
so I think that the biggest thing that has helped me with Sabbath is to stop. This is from John Mark Comer. This is not from me. To stop, to rest, to delight, and worship. And those four things can really ebb and flow with one another. And I find that when I'm doing it well, when I'm not running away from my feelings, when I'm actually stopping, when I'm actually resting,
Hmm.
delight is the most natural thing in the world. And you go on a hike and you see trees, and it's like, this tree is so beautiful, God. How did you make this tree? And it's just like this natural delight and worship seeps out of me. It's beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. Stop, rest, delight, and worship. That's The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, right? By John
I
Mark
think
Comer. Is
so.
that
Yeah.
the book for people listening who want to check out the book? The
Look
Ruthless
at that one.
Elimination of Hurry by John Mark Comer. It
Yeah.
almost feels like he's making a cameo appearance on the podcast.
I'm
So
sorry. I listen to him a lot. The other
hey.
one I would recommend is it's called, oh, what's it called? Subversive Sabbath.
Mm,
Subversive Sabbath. That's a tongue
okay.
twister. By AJ Swoboda. He's also on the West Coast, but
Mm.
yeah, it's a really good one if people are interested.
This probably isn't true, but something in me feels very strongly that it's easier to Sabbath on the West Coast with like the Rockies and everything. Probably not true, but maybe I'm jealous. That's probably just what it is. I'll have to like deal with that at my next Sabbath, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the emotional
Jealousy.
pain you'll work through with Jesus.
Why can't I live in the mountains? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh goodness. Well, hey, I know, Eliza, now you're an associate pastor. Is that right? I'm not mistaken on that. Yeah, just in leading a church plant. And before then, you referenced this early, partially because of your Marvel Avengers experience in your life. You have a lot of experience both in youth ministry, both in leading youth ministry, but also in working with Youth for Christ. And I'd love to learn from your perspective, one, what you would say, man, this is the greatest need for youth today, whether that be for youth listening in or for their parents or adults in their lives who want to invest, to say, man, this is what youth really need
Mm.
from the generation or generations ahead of them. And then on the flip side, what would you say are the things that you would say, these are the really good strengths and the great questions and the great perspectives that our youth are bringing, that we need to recognize and nurture and lean into?
Mm. Wow. I don't know if I can say 1000% this is exactly what youth need, but I can tell you from what I've seen through my own youth ministry and then through working, for Change Conference, where we get to minister to thousands of youth across Canada, which I'm so thankful for. Let's start with the positives. They're amazing, Luke. And
Mm,
I feel like sometimes we can have certain generations can have this fear of like youth and teenagers and Gen Z. And it's like, oh my gosh, like they're the TikTok generation. They've grown up on social media, like all these things. And there totally are scary things out there, but these kids are amazing.
mm,
When we had Change Conference finally back in person this last year, and I had never seen the response from these students ever in our all of our years of doing Change Conference, the genuine, authentic response that they had to Jesus. I just kept crying because they so love him. And when they are in, they are so in. Like if they're not wishy-washy, they're not
mm.
inauthentic. It's like when they devote themselves to Jesus, they are so fully devoted. And I deeply appreciate that. Like my generation, I have a lot of friends who've been like a bit wishy-washy and
Mm.
and there are some tough things that we're all kind of working through with our faith traditions and all of those things. But let me tell you, like these teenagers and Gen Z, they when they're in, they're in. And I think that that's amazing. The authenticity is amazing. They don't care very much about fancy things. Like they're like, just give it to me straight, tell me like
Mm.
it is. And I
Mm.
don't think we have to sugarcoat. I think that we can be really honest, and they're appreciating that honesty.
Yeah.
And then the thing that I think that they need, or one of the things that they need, I would say, would be hope. And I think that we see a lot of students. We have one of the highest suicide rates right now in teenagers, both girls and boys, skyrocketing rates of depression and anxiety. Like we've seen, this is not new. We've seen this. And so what combats that? I would say hope. And
Mm.
and maybe we come at it from a way of like Jesus is the hope of the world. You and I know this, but how do we teach these students to first fall in love and be compelled by Jesus?
Mm.
And then maybe we get to the other stuff, because when someone loves Jesus, when they are compelled by Jesus, when they decide to devote their life to Jesus, then they can come under his teachings, in
Mhm.
my opinion. In my
Yeah.
opinion, somebody else might feel differently, but I think that we have an opportunity for our Gen Z youth, and I'm so excited for them. Like the things that they are doing across our country and the way that they're responding to Jesus is so beautiful. But how do we show them that Jesus is the hope of the world, and then compel them with his beauty? That would be what I would say.
Yeah. Do you feel that there's ever an element of that is just understanding how God is present in suffering? I just ask that. It just popped into my head because I know, as I've interacted in my own experience with youth, for those that don't really have an understanding of God's work or presence in suffering, when you look at a post-Christian culture, the best that culture has to offer is denying
Mhm.
suffering, or just distracting yourself as long as possible from suffering. So feel free to agree or disagree, but would you say that part of that is just understanding where God is and what he's up to when we suffer?
Yeah, I think we need to stop hiding God from suffering. I think that it's really, at least a lot of ways that I grew up, it was like this scary thing to talk about suffering and God. It's like, oh, maybe we shouldn't talk about that. Luke, every single person is experiencing suffering to some extent. So why don't we talk to them about how God is so with them in it? And I think that the problem with that is that we can't give it a really easy answer, because there is no easy answer.
Hmm.
And so maybe instead of easy answers, we come at it with real authenticity and like, I don't know. I don't
Hmm.
know. I
Hmm.
don't know. I don't know why this happened. There's a woman in my church right now. She's not Gen Z. She's in her 40s, but she's been given just a few months left to live. And so we are meeting weekly. She just wants to chat with me every week. And it's a wonderful honor and privilege to meet with her every week. And so we are working through questions of, why does this happen? And Luke, every week, I don't know what to say. I don't have an
Hmm.
answer for her. I don't have, like, we read scripture and we pray through Psalms and all of that, but I don't have like a sermon that I can give to her to say, this is why this is happening to you. I don't have that. But every single week before I leave, we hold hands and we pray for
Mm.
intimacy with Jesus, for presence, and for her to know that God is close to her.
Mm.
I don't have answers, but I think that you're absolutely right with like, we need to be able to talk about God being present in our suffering. I think you're right.
Yeah. And there's something beautiful about the story you just shared about the witness,
Yeah.
if that makes sense, of walking with people who are facing the hardest realities in life.
Yes,
So,
because here's the thing, when I have and I can only speak from my own experience, when I have been experiencing pain,
mm,
I don't actually want someone to fix it. I want someone to sit with me in it.
yeah.
And so we want to fix things, or we want to say the right word, or because it's so uncomfortable to sit with someone in their pain. Forget it.
Mm,
It's so uncomfortable. But I think that it speaks more like Jesus is present with us. And guess what? He doesn't always take the pain away, but
yeah.
he's with us in it. And so I
Yeah.
wonder what it could look like in our churches, in our communities, in our homes, if instead of trying to fix people's pain or take it away or have the right answers or have the right doctrine or have the right theology, if we
Mm,
sat with them in it. I don't know. I don't know.
yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's when I think of the times in my life where I felt most hurt or most helped, it's usually been an instance where I was in pain and someone chose to not even try to fix, but even like critique that. It's funny how people will be like, I'm going through this and it's awful. And people will be like, well, let's kind of evaluate that
Yeah.
through. And you're like, no,
Helpful. Thank you.
yeah,
That's exactly what I needed to hear.
exactly. But it's been amazing to
Mm.
see the encouragement that just comes from people who just like show up. I think it's Rick Warren that says,
Mm.
you want to help people who are suffering, show up and shut up.
It's
And I'm
beautiful.
like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Thank
Yeah.
you, Rick. That's
Yeah.
good.
No kidding. That's good. Yeah.
Well, Eliza, thank you for that. And we've covered a lot together in our conversation. And I just appreciate that as somebody who is thinking deeply about life and faith and creativity and the Avengers, that there's probably a part of you that is like, you know what? I'd love it if someone would ask me about this. And it's never landed on your plate yet. So what's that one question, whether it's in serving as a pastor, whether it's in some of the interviews you've done or other contexts, what's one question that you're like, you know what? I've always wanted someone to ask me this, but you've never been asked it.
Oh my goodness, Luke, this is really hard. I don't know if I've really thought this through before. No, I think that there's just something, the thing that I kind of keep thinking about, and this, maybe not everybody will agree with me. So, and maybe in a year I won't agree with me, which is always the problem, right? Like you
Hey,
think about things and you say them, and you're like, oh, I wish I had never said that. But I think because I'm in this space of pastoring and it's very new to me, and I'm a female pastor, and that's rocks some boats sometimes, which is really
mm,
so fun and interesting to kind of be a part of. I think I just would love for people to really think about like, what does it mean right now to shepherd people in our
mm,
world?
mm,
Because we've put a lot of people on pedestals, particularly in the Christian world. We have celebrity pastors, and that's just an interesting thing for us to think about.
mhm,
And we have a lot of hurting people. We have a lot of people who have experienced deep religious wounds and church hurt. And so
mm,
there is a lot of things in church right now that we are navigating. And so I think the thing for me that I would just love people to think about, and this isn't even really answering your question, but how do we shepherd people well? Like, I don't really know what I'm doing, which maybe I shouldn't admit on a podcast. I should maybe keep that internal. But every time someone walks through the doors of my church, I think to myself, how can I make sure that they leave feeling like they belong here?
mm,
Because we just are living in a time where people have been so deeply hurt by church, and the answer can't possibly be that you stop being a part of a church. Like for me,
mm,
that can't be the answer. I
mm,
wonder if there's another answer of like, how do we as people who strongly believe in Jesus's rule and reign for the world, who believe and are under the authority of scripture, how do we shepherd people really well.
Yeah.
And I'm still learning the answer. I don't know it yet. So if people have ideas, let me know.
Well, it's a great question to be asking, both because I've benefited as much as the next person from some of the writing or teaching or insights of some of the well-known or celebrity pastors out
Right.
there.
And
But
by no means do I think that that's wrong. It's just things I'm working through.
well, no, you're right. And because on the flip side, the other piece of that is that most of them don't know I exist. Uh, right. So they can teach in a way that is helpful for me, but they can't shepherd me.
Right.
And there's something about being embedded in community that allows for me to shepherd and be shepherded,
Mm,
which, as you said, is so vital to all of us. So,
mhm.
well, Eliza, I'm grateful, very grateful for the time you've made to contribute to this conversation, and would love for people who are listening to be able to say, hey, if we want to learn more about Eliza or discover some of her writing or creative work, or just connect with her online, where can they do that?
I think the best place right now would be on Instagram. That's where I'm most active. It's just Aliza Latta. Um, and then if they want to check out Change Conference, the ministry that we have there, or the church I'm pastoring is called Mountainside Dundas. So I am all over the place and I'd love to connect with people there.
And well, and forgive me for adding this, but is there not elizalatta.com?
There is, but I never update it.
Yes.
They can go on it. It's old.
Hey, there's good stuff there. There's good stuff there.
Oh,
Well,
thanks.
thank you. Thanks a million for that. And thanks for this time. I'm really grateful we could have this conversation.
Thank you.